What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily, and in this video, we are doing a speed and performance test featuring 3 of Samsung's A series phones, the A05, the A15, and the A25. Now, these are sort of the 3 bottom tier or cheapest devices in the A series lineup this year, and what you guys often ask me is something to the extent of, is getting, say, the A15 worth it over the A05, or is the A25 that much better than the other cheaper phones? And those are the sorts of questions I hope to answer in this video when it comes to actual performance and overall usage, not just the specs on paper. Also, it's important to keep in mind that while the price difference across the board doesn't seem significant, it may only be $50 or $100 each way. When we're talking about $150 or $200 devices, that is a significant difference percentage-wise. I mean, the A15 is like twice as expensive compared to the A05, and the A25 full retail is like another 30% more expensive. Prices vary all around for these phones. Some carriers may even give them away for free, but with each bump up, you can expect to pay $50 or $100 more at least, and that's quite the jump in this price range. To kick things off, I want to just briefly tell you the specs of each phone so you know what you're working with, and then I'll show you the Geekbench scores before we get into the side-by-side performance comparison, but feel free to jump ahead if you want. The A05 is powered by the MediaTek Helio G85 processor, which is now more than 4 years old, and it's very much a lower tier component by today's standards. Paired with just 4 GB of RAM and 64 GB of storage, I think you can see why this phone is so inexpensive. But we still get a fan favorite chip manufacturer and a full-fledged Samsung and Android experience, so it's not all bad news. My A15 here is the 5G variant, and it's also powered by a MediaTek chip, the Dimensity 6100 Plus, which is not even a year old yet, and I think offers more bang for your buck than you might expect. It's also powered by 6 GB of RAM and 128 GB of storage, so you're getting more of everything if you opt for the A15. The A25 is sort of the odd one out. It utilizes Samsung's own Exynos 1280, which originally shipped with the A53 a couple of years ago, but is now being reused in this cheaper phone. Samsung's Exynos processors bring about some strong opinions from those who aren't necessarily a fan, though I think you could argue that there's still some value here, but my phone doesn't have any more RAM or storage than the A15, so perhaps that's one more thing to consider. And if you want a processor-to-processor comparison specifically, that's exactly what you'll see between the A15 and A25 in this video. Now, as promised, here are the Geekbench performance scores for all 3 phones, so you can get sort of a numeric comparison across the board, and maybe even compare these numbers to your current phone if you want. The important thing to consider, as I alluded to earlier, is that the jump from the A05 to the A15 is much more significant than from the A15 to the A25, especially when you consider the multi-core scores of the processors. And this effectively means that the potential processing power and day-to-day speed and performance is going to be more similar between the A15 and the A25, and the A05 might be more noticeably slow or sluggish, which I think you'll be able to see in just a second. All 3 phones are running the latest version of Android and Samsung's One UI that they currently support, and unlike in years past, these budget phones aren't running One UI Core or a lesser version of Android, so that's great. And they've all been set up the same way with the same apps and settings and logins, so it's as fair of a test as possible. However, there's one other difference that will certainly affect the visual speed and fluidity of on-screen animations. The A05's display is a 60Hz LCD panel, so there's no high refresh rate or motion smoothing option. The A15 has a higher 90Hz refresh rate, while the A25 has arguably a flagship caliper 120Hz screen. It might be hard to tell, but to me, the A05 is always going to look a little choppier, with less precise physical on-screen touches and less smooth scrolls and swipes. The A15 and A25 are a little tougher to tell apart, but when you watch the side-by-side speed tests, take into consideration the A05's lower refresh rate display as well when analyzing swipes and scrolls. So I always say that for a vast majority of people who utilize their phones for the simple stuff, Phone calls, text messages, web browsing, light social media scrolling, YouTube video watching, any entry-level or cheap phone is gonna do just fine. Cheap phones are plenty good nowadays, and the fraction of a second difference you might see launching the Google Play Store on the A25 is obviously not worth the extra $100 or $150 over the A05. The A05 is slower in almost everything it does, sure, but it's not a slow, clunky phone to use by any means. In fact, it's significantly better than all the previous A0 Samsung smartphones I was oh so critical of, and if you just need a functional, familiar Android device to keep you connected to the world and reliably do the simple smartphone stuff you need, the A05 isn't really going to let you down. With that being said, it's not always the smoothest experience. I think you can see that, especially with clunky websites and app pop-ups. And you'll see as we go through this speed test that 4 gigabytes of RAM just isn't enough these days to keep apps running in the background indefinitely. But I don't know that folks who opt for the A05 would even use their phone as extensively as I'm using it in this comparison video. To me, the more surprising thing about this speed test is the difference, or lack thereof, between the A15 and the A25. In fact, there are plenty of instances where the A15 and A25 launch and load stuff in an identical fashion, and sometimes the A15 is randomly a little faster. Now, is that reason enough to criticize or dismiss the A25 and its Exynos processor like I'm sure so many people want to do? Not necessarily, but consider this. If you know the A25 doesn't perform so much better than the A15 that you'd notice it on any given day, is it really worth the extra money? I think you'd have to consider the other things, like the better display on the A25 or the camera differences, but to me, I feel like the A15 is exactly the right balance of performance and price. And that's why I mentioned earlier that it was a surprising sort of bang for your buck contender. I mean, there's a reason this particular tier of A series, the A1X tier, like the A13 and A14s and this year's A15, are some of the best-selling smartphones year after year worldwide. They just seem to offer that perfect balance of a decent price point paired with decent speed and specs. The only reason to consider the A25 on a performance basis, in my opinion, is if gaming is your thing. And I don't necessarily mean like simple puzzle games or even the more story-oriented titles that play the same screen by screen and action by action on every device. I mean the games that you play online with or against friends, or against simulated opponents that actually do different things, like first-person shooters, battle royales, racing games, some fighting games, stuff like that, where peak performance is actually something that may give you an edge. On the one hand, I don't feel that the A05 or A15 are clunky or run games at a noticeably low frame rate. I mean, the A05 is definitely slower to do most things, but in-game performance isn't really suffering. It's just that the A25 tends to do everything faster, and I think the most graphics-intense games will play better 100% of the time on the A25. Some people are certainly going to say that the Exynos processor isn't good for gaming, whether it be a throttling or overheating issue or a reliability deal. It's not really something I experienced in this video, but in this particular comparison between these 3 phones, I think if you're spending most of your time gaming, the A25 is probably worth the extra dollars, and it's the only true performance element you'll decisively gain. But that's for likely a small subset of people who, let's be honest, wouldn't exactly choose the A25 specifically for gaming anyway. I mean, a $300 or $400 used older flagship is probably a better choice in that regard. Now, if you're wondering about RAM usage and battery life throughout this test, what was sort of interesting here is that with all the same apps open and running, each phone wound up utilizing different amounts of its built-in memory. The A05, for example, had used up almost 75% of its RAM, and it definitely struggled to keep everything current, even though I only loaded 30 or 35 apps. The A15 used up 2/3 of its memory, while The A25 seems to have had better RAM management while still keeping apps running, but it may not be the most power efficient, with a couple percent battery lower than the others, even though they all have 5,000 milliamp battery capacities, though I'm not sure that that's statistically significant. To me, with specifically performance in mind, there's three conclusions I think I drew from this test. One, the A05 is a decent phone, way better than previous entry-level A-series phones, and I don't think performance is an issue at all. So if you have to have the cheapest one of the bunch, you aren't getting something that's unusable or unreliable like the phones from a couple of years ago. It's totally fine. The A15, I think, is the best balance of price and performance. It's just as fast as the more expensive A25 for quite a bit less money. And I don't think anyone would really notice. Maybe you'd prefer to get a MediaTek processor anyway over an Exynos. Speaking of Exynos, my third conclusion is that the A25 to me doesn't seem like a must-have strictly based on performance. I mean, sure, it's a bit faster overall and is probably the more favorable gaming device, but is it worth the extra money? I don't think so, but I'd have to consider the other stuff like the display and the camera to really justify that. But what do you guys think? Was this speed test surprising in any way? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, of course. And let me know which apps or games I should utilize in my future speed tests if there's anything in particular you want to see. But hopefully you guys did enjoy this video. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already. And I'll see you guys later.